Hello everyone, welcome to MMA Start to Finish. I'm Julian, and this is Matt.
Hi.
And today we're going to be talking about UFC 9 Motor City Madness from the Cobo Arena in Detroit, Michigan. Apparently, according to the telecast, the Pistons used to play there. Also, early note about a lot of controversy surrounding this event. I just thought it was very funny that after a Michigan-specific politician went to Puerto Rico to protest the UFC in Puerto Rico, the UFC was like, let's make it a little easier for you. Park in your state capital.
We're now in the heart.
Definitely no rowdy fans at all doing crazy shit that would be frowned upon now.
No.
None of that whatsoever.
No. We're classy here.
Classy Detroit. That's what you think when you think of Detroit.
Yeah,
right?
speaking of.
No disrespect to our Detroit listeners.
Class is in session.
And it's strictly pass or fail.
Yeah.
According to Bruce Beck.
Yeah. I love these stupid intros.
It's just like, it's so aggressively 90s.
Yeah.
I can't help but love it.
I mean, they're in the thick of it.
It is 96.
Yeah.
They're in full swing of the Clinton administration.
They started off with an interview with Dan Severn, and they interviewed someone else. Who they interviewed?
They interviewed Ken, too. They interviewed both them in the locker room.
I thought everyone kind of looked like firefighters with the getup, but that's just how they looked. It's a different pacing this time.
Yeah, so something important to note that they didn't really note during the telecast, as far as we could tell. This is the first UFC event to not feature the tournament format, which apparently was brought back by popular demand for the next event in UFC 10. Instead, the card featured 8 regulation bouts, and one of them being the super fight. Not all of the same time limit. I think, well, here's the thing. They didn't really mention the time limits unless they were talking about the super fight, and none of the other fights went to decision, so I don't really know what the time limits were for.
They're probably 15 minutes.
I'd have to imagine 15. That was what it was last time, correct?
Yeah. Because one of the fights, just looking at the page, goes to 12 minutes, and
it has the result by cut.
Yeah.
So
15 minutes seems like a good round number.
Yeah, I think that's what they were working with before. I just wish they would have mentioned that. Honestly, the whole broadcast was kind of marred by being like sloppy and weird, and the final fight sort of bore that out in the octagon. Oh, so apparently, the UFC 8, of course, was not the last time there would be moral panic about the UFC. Things intensified here. The UFC drew national criticism leading up to the event. I'm reading this from Wikipedia. Due in large part to, wait for it, Arizona Senator John McCain's letter-writing campaign against the brutal spectacle of no-holds-barred fighting. After a legal battle in the Detroit courts up until 4:30 the day of the show, the UFC was allowed to continue, but with modified rules. Here's the thing. Had you not gone to this Wikipedia page and just watched the event, they don't disclose any of this.
Nope.
So this is all just like post-mortem, basically. We're finding this stuff out. So throughout the card, while fighters are throwing punches, you would hear Big John going, open the hands, and we're like, why is he telling them to open hands?
Keep
like,
your hands open.
Yeah, like, what's that all about? So apparently, the special rules included no closed fist strikes to the head and no headbutts. And I'm quoting Wikipedia here, a rule that referee John McCarthy attempted to enforce, but with little success.
Yep.
Get this. Before the show, fighters were warned to not use closed fist strikes under penalty of arrest.
Yep.
Send him to prison. Go into a different cage. Although many fights that night included closed fist strikes and no fighters were arrested because that would be insane.
Yeah.
Can you imagine?
Every fighter would have been arrested.
Everyone. Nobody went open hand. Come on now.
The, I guess, rule of no kicking with shoes on was mostly not followed.
So we had one fighter, and let's just hop into the first fight. Our first fight of the night was Zane Frazier versus Cal Worsham, and Cal Worsham was wearing the wrestling shoes that we'd seen before, and up until this point, the rules were such that if you wore the wrestling shoes, you couldn't kick. But like Cal threw a leg kick, and John didn't say anything to him. He only threw one, so maybe John just didn't notice, and none of the other fighters on the card that wore shoes threw any kicks.
Yeah.
So like it's hard for us to figure out. But you know, with all the controversy this event was marred by, it just makes things more confusing, honestly.
Yeah, there's a lot of unspoken things going on here.
Yeah, it was like I said, a sloppy telecast, but under the the legal situation where 4:30 day of the show, they were not sure if they were going to go to jail.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I get why it was sloppy.
Maybe the people, like, This is us in 2019.
Yeah, we're just talking shit.
Looking back at 1996, 7?
96, yeah.
So maybe back then everyone had an idea of what was going on with the sport, so people were more informed about it as to what's going on.
What do you mean?
Like the big news with John McCain saying this is terrible stuff, and
I hear
so
what you're
then
saying.
They make an announcement saying that these are some of the rules or changes that we're making
to try to appease them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's all that was about. Like, the UFC wasn't like, we want to get rid of closed fish strikes.
Yeah.
They're like, what the hell are you talking about? That's an integral part of fighting. But we'll talk more about the weird stuff surrounding the event later. Let's get into the first fight. So Zane Frazier and Cal Worsham, who we'd both seen before. Zane Frazier lost in UFC 1 to Kevin Rozier. And Cal Worsham, I don't remember who Cal Worsham lost to earlier. I'll check that for you. It was Paul Varlins at UFC 6. He lost to Paul Varlins via elbows. Oh, okay. Cal Worsham, now that I'm looking at this, I remember. Cal Worsham was the dude with, like, the 12-6 elbow Paul landed, where he went, like, boom, and the dude dropped. That was Cal.
Yeah.
So, two guys with spurious records in the first fight tonight. Yeah. So, Zane came out in MMA gloves and
had a 7-inch height advantage.
So, he apparently had played, I don't know if he played in the NBA, but they said he was at training camps for, like, the New Jersey Nets and stuff like that. So, a lifelong athlete, not exactly a friend of the octagon. Got taken down by Cal, who... Cal, of course, has grappling experience, but he's no Hoist Gracie. And Cal, would you remember if it was mount or was it just like half guard? Because he was on top of Zane, and I'll let you tell us how this fight ends.
Cal didn't have... I don't think he had mount.
Okay.
I think he was just on top.
Yeah.
I would have put that in my notes. But we kind of expected a striking match between these two.
Yeah, because Cal's background was karate and Zane's background was kickboxing. So we're like, oh, these guys, this is going to be... You know, they were fighting guys before, both of them, that had different skill sets that weren't exactly compatible with a great fight. We figured these guys, both being strikers, would keep it standing up. But I guess Cal felt like he had a better advantage going to the ground, and turns out he was right.
Yeah, and Zane kind of just tapped after failing to do much of anything except get punched.
Yeah, I want to look here at UFC 9's Wikipedia. Is this another... submission to position? What do they have here? TKO punches.
Yeah.
That's not accurate.
Yeah.
That's not accurate at all. It was another one of those ones. He just tapped to position, basically. Like, he caught a couple of strikes, so it wasn't like he wasn't getting hit at all. But it wasn't... You would not see a fight end like this today.
Yeah. There was a prelim fight that we didn't see with Steve Nelmark versus Ty Bowden. There's no page for Ty Bowden, and Steve Nelmark only has 2 fights in his history, so neither one of them was very notable. But what was notable was the massive blood stains on the canvas.
Yeah, before nominally the first fight of the event, we're like, I wonder how those blood stains got there.
Yeah.
We realized it was a prelim fight.
And we'll see more blood stains added as time goes on.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. We didn't really mention it just before, but we did have the 3 judges again. We saw their faces and everything.
They're made publicly available. The
first guy, I can't remember his name.
I'll tell you right now, I don't remember any of their names.
Yeah.
Not a single one of them.
He teaches a self-defense class.
Yeah.
The second guy, kind of creepy looking.
Yeah, we paid zero attention to what that dude did because he looked like the crypt keeper and we couldn't stop laughing. Yeah. Not to be rude, but dude looked like he guards cemeteries. So let's be real here.
And the third guy was just a retired NFL player.
Yeah. So, eclectic group we have judging this event.
Yep.
And those judges will come into play later tonight. So up next we have Rafael Kirino versus Matt Anderson. And before Rafael came out, because he came to the octagon first, they aired this little video package they had talking about the legacy of Brazilian fighters in the UFC, which was pretty cool, especially considering the sport's still so early at that point. But now we see... There was a period in time where most of the UFC champions were Brazilian. Like, I think if you look at, like, say this is the Olympics, and you look at how many countries have held titles, it's the USA number 1, obviously, because it's a US-born sport. But number 2 is Brazil by, like, a mile. Mm-hmm. They have a lot of titles and great history in MMA, and obviously are integral in founding the UFC at all. So they were kind of building him up as they showed Hoist Gracie, they showed Marco Ruas, they showed... the guy that Paul beat in a boring fight for some reason, and then they brought this guy out. It was kind of a cool way to actually build him up a little bit. Unfortunately, Rafael has no Wikipedia page.
I wonder how long that video would be now.
Like, probably be a whole documentary.
Yeah. And it's just listing names. It's like credits, but that's the whole video.
Yeah, for like 20 minutes.
Yeah. Rafael he claimed he has no experience getting hit.
Which I find hard to believe.
Like he never sparred?
Right?
You think...
At this point, you have to know you're going to like get punched at in the UFC.
Yeah.
So even if you are a grappler, you have to train in striking, even a little bit. Even Dan figured that out later.
I was real worried that he was just going to get hit in the face and be totally stunned.
Yeah, Rafael, nicknamed the Earthquake, came out storming, took Matt Anderson to the ground, and honestly, Matt just kind of looked like a fish out of water for the whole fight.
That's kind of just his face.
That too. Again, not to be a complete dick,
Yeah.
but I think I said he looked like he was on meth as he was walking to the octagon. I think that's what I said.
I don't know if he looks like he's on meth. I told
Obviously, he's not on meth. I'm just talking shit.
Yeah.
But he had a weird-looking face.
I described it as he looks like he's always having a flashback. His eyes are just so wide. And
It doesn't help how he has this, like,
taking in everything.
aggressive forehead, too.
True.
So Rafael took him out, climbed on top of Matt Anderson, landed some pretty serious punches, and then John stepped in after Matt clearly was not intelligently defending himself. It was clear that he was just outclassed.
Yeah, Anderson, he had a good defense at first, but it was quickly falling apart. Rafael was just breaking it down, and there was a pretty sizable cut on his forehead before it got called by John.
Yeah, I'm trying to see, because there was a few ones tonight that were stopped by doctor stoppage because of cuts. This was not one of those. It just says TKO to punches. But as we've been over, the Wikipedia record is not always exactly accurate.
Yeah.
So, take that with a grain of salt. Up next, we have a fight between two pretty big names, some for different reasons than others. Gary Goodridge is back, Big Daddy, and he says in his intro video, "I'm not no loser."
Yep.
As he dramatically removes his sunglasses. Dude, I don't know if he did it, and actually, let's look at his Wikipedia page. Was Gary Goodridge one of the guys who was like, I'm just going to be a professional wrestler now? Because he would have done real good at that. No, I don't see that on his Wikipedia page at all. Any pro wrestling stuff. Dude would have been amazing.
I think it would have been pretty good. He's a little... It's weird to say. He's a little... I feel like he'd be a little small for it.
For pro wrestling?
Yeah.
Potentially.
He'd have to do a lot more vitamins.
A lot more Mexican supplements.
Vitamins. He just loves those Flintstones vitamins.
Fun fact about Gary Goodridge, as he was walking to the octagon, the announcers casually noted, because as you know, Gary Goodridge, renowned arm wrestling champion, Gary defeated 1,000 men in under 2 hours in Japan. How do you even do that logistically? I guess he beat a bunch of those dudes in like less than 5 seconds, right?
Yeah.
The first 10 must have just been mowed the fuck down.
First 10, more like...
First
just
300.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just like, whap, next. Whap, next. That's just...
I wonder how many human beings can say they defeated 1,000 people in an arm wrestling contest in under 2 hours. Is it just Gary? I probably imagine it's just Gary.
I feel like you'd have a hard time just getting 1,000 people together to do it.
Right? Like, logistically, how to even set that up? Anyway. Gary was taking on Mark Schultz. Mark Schultz does not have an accomplished MMA career. What's notable about Mark is his brother, Dave Schultz, who was an acclaimed amateur and Olympic wrestler and was tragically killed. So, Dave was not actually supposed to fight tonight. It was supposed to be Gary versus Dave Beneteau. But, funny enough, so Mark was sparring, or training, I guess, with Dave, and Dave broke his hand sparring with Mark, and the referee, or the doctors rather, would not allow him to compete. So the dude that accidentally broke his hand took his spot. Mark stepped in. Mark said something interesting, too, after the fight. We'll get to the fight itself, of course, but after the fight, he said, when asked if he would be back, he said something about the pay, and if, like, we'll see if they start bringing in some money or something like that, which is an interesting point. Because I imagine, especially this event, these guys were not making a ton of money. Another note about the moral panic surrounding this event is, let me find this specific excerpt for you, because it was good. Following the legal battle over UFC 9, Senator John McCain was successful in pulling UFC pay-per-view broadcasts from numerous cable systems. So we'll see a point in time where I think, I'll remember the name when we get to it, but it was only one provider that even allowed you to see the UFC. It got banned from a ton of different outlets. And we see the impacts of this here. From the framing here, I can't tell if it was banned from any of these systems before this event or after this event, but regardless, if you look at the buy rate, go to UFC 8, 300,000 buy rate. 3 months later, UFC 9, 141.
That's less than half.
So I'm assuming, way less exposure. Way less people are even able to access this.
Yeah.
Let's talk about underground. So let's get to the actual fight. Mark Schultz versus Gary Goodridge. Matt, what do you have on this one?
Schultz took the top of Gary, but Gary had this weird, like, it wasn't a headlock. He just, like, had his arm around his head.
Yeah, he had his arm framed up for, like, a choke, but he didn't sink his other arm in under the neck. So a lot of the fight just consisted of, like, Mark taking him down.
Yeah.
And because Gary was wearing his gi, he was able to just control position sort of while he was on the ground, and he was grabbing at his own sleeve of his gi while he was underneath Mark to prevent him from just beating the shit out of him, really.
The gi much more useful now that it's nice, cool Detroit instead of
100-degree Puerto Rico.
Yeah. It's too warm for that.
I understand why you see more violence in, like, hotter areas, because you've been exposed to the heat for long enough. I imagine you get a little ornery.
Oh, probably a little bit. They got stood up at one point because John wanted Gary to get checked because he was bleeding.
There was a lot. Yeah, there was a lot of. I imagine the what's the word I'm looking for? The acquiescence to the doctors, I imagine, was a result of all these legal concerns. They brought in the doctors to check cuts a lot more than they did before. I have to imagine that had something to do with the court proceedings and just, like, them being extra careful about everything.
I wonder if John McCain knew that it wasn't the closed fists that make most of these cuts. It's the elbows.
Yeah, here's the thing. The reason I get so indignant about all the criticism is because it comes from such an uninformed place. These people have no clue, or, I mean, no one's protesting MMA anymore. It's well into, like, the mainstream now. But back then, people that were protesting the sport knew nothing about it.
Yeah.
Which is why it's so frustrating.
They just didn't know what they were talking about.
Yeah, even some of the people involved in making the rules didn't know what they were talking about. So this is like an old story. Anybody who's listening to this has probably heard before. But so when they were making the rules, and this is a story from John McCarthy, when they were making the rules, so you know how 12-6 elbows are illegal now?
Yep.
The reason they're illegal is because some dipshit saw one of those karate demonstrations where they, like, break ice doing that, and he's like, oh, what's that gonna do to somebody's head? Hey, asshole, you're not generating that much more force. It's not... There's no, like, credible... This is my point. It's just frustrating when people have control over this when they're uninformed.
And for most of those demonstrations, those cement blocks and wooden boards...
It's all pre-cut. Come on.
They have indentations, and they're made to be broken.
It's just, like, such a... It's so weird that you would draw a rule from such an arbitrary event like that.
Yeah. But back to the fight. Gary eventually had a puddle of blood under his head, but he held a good defense the whole time. He never, like, was knocked out.
Yeah, he didn't get... It does say here, I believe, TKO to a cut. So, yeah, it was a... That's wild. Why don't they say doctor stoppage cut? Because cut means by doctor stoppage, unless the cut was stopped because of Big John. Anyway, not important. So, yeah, they stopped the fight due to some cuts that Gary had, and Gary was... I have here Gary out-techniqued, and there was some confusion at the end of the fight about if it was going to overtime or not.
Yeah. The commentators were talking about how it was going into overtime, but then the cut doctor said no overtime.
So I guess they kind of contradicted themselves there a little bit.
So that answers
our question. So it is 12 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah, because if they were considering going to OT, that makes sense. Okay, so I guess it was 12 minutes for the undercard. Again, they didn't mention this, which I find distressing.
We're learning as it goes along.
Honestly, this event feels more ramshackle than some of the earlier ones we watched.
Yeah.
I mean, part of that, I feel like, is probably a result of, like, the quality of the main event, but we'll get there. Anything else on Mark Schultz versus Gary Goodridge?
Gary's a fun guy, but he didn't do too well. He's
got some work to do.
Yeah.
He certainly has, because this is all post-hoc, right?
Mm-hmm.
But he seemed like a dude who had a lot of potential and obviously had the physique for this. So,
yeah.
We will see Gary again.
He takes his vitamins.
He definitely is fully stocked on his supplements.
Yeah. Our next fight is Koji Kitao.
I think that's right.
Versus Mark Hall, and
we have some conflicting opinions about this this fight. So Koji was a Yokozuna in Japan, which is like the supreme title for sumo wrestling. I'm not gonna sit here and tell you I know shit about sumo wrestling, but they were touting him as a very accomplished sumo wrestler. And his Wikipedia page, it's weird because it makes it look like he's dead. Because his picture on Wikipedia is a picture of his handprint that's displayed on a monument in Tokyo. But like just that imagery makes it look like it's a memorial.
Yeah, like that would be like on his gravestone or
yeah,
something.
like we saw that and we were like, oh, he's dead. And then we looked and we're like, no, he's 55. He's not even that old.
Yeah.
It's just like alarming to see that. Anyway, Koji took on Mark Hall, and Koji was obviously, like we said, a sumo wrestler, and the prior history of sumo wrestlers in the UFC was spurious to say the least. So we were kind of...
They're quickly taken out.
Yeah, we're kind of just waiting for this dude to get consumed, basically.
Yeah. But...
You can break down the fight. It's very short. So.
It was a very short fight. How long was it?
It was 40 seconds.
And even that's debatable.
Yeah, that seems a little long, honestly.
If anything, that was just them sizing each other up for that long. The first attempt at anything happening was Koji rushing to Mark Hall. Mark got one good hit on Koji's nose.
Yeah, before Koji was able to like get in there for the takedown, Mark backed up a little bit enough to frame away for enough space for one right hand. And apparently this man's an anime character, because that's all he needed. Koji went in for the takedown, and Big John immediately stepped in to stop the fight, and we were very confused.
But at that point, the camera was facing Koji's back as Koji was heading towards Mark Hall, so we didn't see this punch.
Yeah, and they didn't have a very good replay until, oddly, the end of the night when they were showing, like, highlights of all the fights.
Yeah.
Then we finally saw the angle where the punch landed, but up until the end of the night, we didn't see the punch that had hit Koji. We were very confused about what happened.
For all we knew, it could have just been Mark's shoulder hitting Koji's nose.
Yeah.
And that could have been the problem. But Koji was pretty on top of Mark, and I feel like had the stoppage not happened, Koji would have won. Or at least dominated the beginning of this fight.
This is where we disagree, because I don't mind John stopping the fight for a broken nose. Like, I feel like that makes sense. But I also understand Matt's argument of, even though his nose was broken, he was in the dominant position. Yeah. Like, I don't know how much longer he would have been able to continue with a broken nose, but at that point, he wasn't in a bad spot. I also wonder, as a sumo wrestler, sumo wrestling doesn't involve any strikes, so has this man ever had his nose broken before? Probably not.
Probably not, but it seemed like he was ready to keep fighting.
Yeah, so here's another point where we kind of disagree. So after the stoppage, you see him, the word I'll just use is exasperated, like next to John, and I believe he didn't speak English, they had a translator there.
Yeah.
And it looked like Matt thought he was upset from the stoppage. I thought he was just like grimacing from his broken nose. We'll never really know, but yeah, this is one where we actually kind of disagree about whether we thought the stoppage was good or not.
Yeah. I think it makes sense from a medical standpoint. I think it was a bad stoppage from Koji's perspective.
Well, yeah, as somebody who's making their UFC debut and wants to make a name for themselves. Yeah. But this was this guy's first ever combat sports competition in America. They made a point of announcing that before the fight.
Yeah.
Oh, another fun note about this fight. After one-punching Koji Kato, or Kayato, that's a different name, Mark, during his post-fight interview, proposed to his girlfriend.
Yeah.
And they, like, totally didn't...
brushed over it.
Yeah.
They just kept going with the interview like it was
They literally were like, that's fucking weird, and, like, just went on with it. They didn't say that's fucking weird, but Jeff, I think his exact words were, I'm not exactly sure this is the venue for a proposal, or something like that. And then they just brushed over it and kept going.
But, not to go back to it too much, but I think Koji, having a sumo wrestler who has 160 pounds over you,
once he's on top of you, that's a problem.
I think he had a good chance of winning, being in that position. That was the best chance for our sumo wrestlers to have a win.
Well, we'll never know, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I hope his nose is okay.
Oh, it's probably fine.
30,
fine.
20 years later.
And he started his sumo wrestling in 79.
Yeah, his sumo wrestling record goes back, way back.
And I think he continued up until some, like, early 2000s. No,
88.
Oh, wow.
And then he transitioned into, retired.
He retired from sumo wrestling in 88, but then he continued...
He did a lot of pro wrestling, apparently. And then transitioned
up
into
until...
MMA.
Okay.
There's a lot of... We'll see this especially a lot once we start watching some Pride events. there's a ton, especially in Japan, of crossover between people who are like active pro wrestlers also doing MMA and active MMA fighters also doing pro wrestling. There's a lot of like, the bonds are close between pro wrestling and the early days of MMA.
He went into coaching in 2003, so that's where he went to it. So maybe he did like some light sparring, but that's about it.
Based on the fact that this dude has a monument in Tokyo, I'd imagine he's like a celebrity.
Yeah. I thought it would be pretty easy for Rich Goins to accidentally mispronounce.
Oh, Yokozuna?
Yeah.
Yeah, he tripped up on that word a little bit. You thought he said...
I didn't think he said it, but I think he was very close to saying Yakuza.
Yeah.
Which might get...
might anger Koji a little bit.
Might get him in some trouble. But that wasn't the case.
Thankfully, catastrophe averted. Up next, we have the most action-packed fight of the evening. Don the Predator Frye versus... I'm going to fuck this guy's name up, I'll tell you right now. Amari Patek?
I think it was Patek.
Patek?
Amari Patek.
So this was another Brazilian fighter who came from... I forget which Gracie they said, but he was schooled by one of the Gracies specifically. So he comes from, like, legit Jiu-Jitsu roots. Unfortunately, for him, Don, at this point, I think is the most well-rounded person we've seen in the UFC.
He's quite the menace.
Yes, because he has a professional boxing background and also an amateur wrestling background. So he's way better on the feet, but also has the skills to keep it there.
Yeah.
And for about 9.5 minutes, just beat the shit out of Amari Patek.
Oh, yeah. It was instant craziness.
This was, the most action-packed fight of the evening.
I would give it the fight of the night.
Yeah, we've been forgetting to do that, I think, but we should definitely give this one fight of the night.
So it was pretty much wrestling/boxing versus Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Like I said, it was instant craziness. At one point, Amari like grabbed onto the front of Don, like completely off the ground, grabbing onto Don, but then lets go. There was a lot happening. They went against the fence a few times. They went on the ground.
The most memorable thing about this fight to me, other than how dominant Don was the fucking... And I get this way about all these elbows, but the sound of the elbows, dude.
They're vicious.
There was at least 20 elbows. At least.
I'd say at least 30. Butchered
that dude. They this was another one where they stopped the fight several times to have the doctor look at cuts. And I think after the second time, they told John... Hey, if he gets in position again where he's getting the shit beaten out of him, you have to stop the fight. The doctor, I think, recommended that to John.
Amari had cuts all over his face.
Yeah, it was brutal.
And it was mostly open palms.
Well, yeah, that's the whole thing. I think even Don, the Dragon, on commentary mentioned most of the cuts don't come from fists. In fighting, most of the cuts come from elbows and, mostly just fucking elbows, really. They're pretty sharp.
Yep. Don was kneeing, elbowing, and I think he headbutted at least once.
At least once, yeah. It was technically not allowed, but...
Amari's head all over the place. On the back of his head, on the top of his head, in the front of his face.
The domination was so complete that during the waning moments of the fight, me and Matt were literally just sitting there with our hands on our head as... Amari's getting kneed in the brainstem, and we're literally just sitting there going, "Stop the fight!"
He was even
Stop the fight.
He was getting elbows to like the lower part of his spine.
Oh yeah, another thing you can't do now. He was dropping 12 to 6 elbows on his spine.
Everything that was happening was illegal.
Yeah, this is just like a masterclass of shit you can't do anymore.
Just show this and say you can't do these things.
Yeah, this is just a video telling them what not to do.
But yeah, John did call it for.
It was a weird stoppage because he wasn't like going to town on him when he pulled him off, but it was just super clear that it was done. You needed to stop. Like,
even when John stopped,
protect the dude a little bit.
Even when John stopped for cuts, he was basically picking Amari up off the ground.
Yeah, the dude was gassed.
But Amari was saying like, "No, I can keep doing it."
I'm surprised because
Brazilian, but
in Portuguese.
Portuguese.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Back then, you saw a lot more of the towels being thrown in. I guess Amari's corner doesn't like him very much.
No.
Because if I was his corner, I would have thrown in that towel after, like, the 18th elbow.
He must have said some nasty shit.
Well, all these guys, I'm sure, like, no, I'm fine, I keep fighting. Even like you were saying, Koji Kato, who got his nose broken, he seemed like he wanted to keep fighting.
Yeah.
So the fighter's not always the best arbiter of if they are in danger or not.
Yeah.
Up next, we have and I use extremely large air quotes, super fight between Dan Severn, the man on your screen if you're watching on YouTube, and the other man on your screen, Ken Shamrock. This is a rematch from, I believe, UFC 6, where Ken won relatively quickly with a choke, and the threat of that choke
neutered Dan.
Yeah, like the threat of that choke was all over this fight. The DNA of that choke was like all over this fight. You could see every decision Dan was making was with the threat of that choke in mind. So yeah, I guess let's just like get into this. I had some like funny stuff before, but the fight was so like lame that I didn't want to measure. Like, Ken had his own walkout song, which was kind of cool. Dan had gloves on, which was interesting because Dan had not worn gloves to that point yet.
Both of our fighters had shoes on.
Yeah, so no kicks. Not much of anything, really.
Yeah.
You want to explain what happened here?
Dan danced around Ken for a solid,
8 minutes.
8 minutes.
8 minutes.
They both tried to throw in some jabs, but nothing was really hitting.
And nobody landed a strike at all until 4 minutes into the fight.
Yeah. Eventually, Ken got a little cut on his cheek or under his eye.
Super superficial.
Dan got a few slaps to the face, but nothing crazy. The crowd was booing. Eventually, a chant for bullshit happened.
It was weird because I feel like those chants should go the other way around, where first you start out with boring, and then you get mad and you go to bullshit. Yeah. Detroit was having none of that. They immediately came out in the first 9 minutes with the bullshit chants, real loud, and then toward the end of the fight it turned to boring.
By the way, this is a crowd chanting boring and bullshit at Dan Severn.
Who's the hometown fighter.
Yeah, but it was kind of some boring bullshit.
Yeah, I'll read this for you. Due in part to the special rule, the super fight between Ken Severn,
Ken Severn.
Ken's fucking Dan Shamrock and Ken Severn.
It's the ultimate combination. They're doing a fusion.
What about Don Severn?
Oh man.
Or Dan Frye?
Which would be bigger, Don Severn? No, not. Which would be bigger?
The
Dan Shamrock or
the Dragon Ball Z style fusion between Dan and Ken or Dan and Don.
Yeah.
I think the better fighter would be the combination of Dan and Don, but the larger human.
Dan and Don is just. I said it before, but they're like a video game combination.
Yeah, they're like a pro wrestling tag team. It's excellent. They just they're some of the first real interesting characters we have in the sport.
First you fight Don, then the actual level boss comes out and it's Dan.
Yeah, we were making this joke last time because the picture we had up was Dan and Don for UFC 8, and we were saying Don was the mini boss before you get to fight Dan.
Yeah, Don is I said Don was like Goku and Dan is like Broly.
That's a fairly accurate assessment. So if you're wondering, while we're just bullshitting here, not really talking about the fight, you saw that fight, you know why.
There's not a whole lot of fight.
Not a lot to talk about. It was literally just Dan circling Ken for 8 or 9 minutes. Eventually, Ken shot for a takedown, got into mount, had mount and landed a few strikes, but really couldn't do anything. Dan then transitioned that mount into him being on top and in Ken's guard, and this was really the only part of the fight where we saw any meaningful damage laid out. So, unlike Ken, when Dan was on top, he started going to town on Ken, and he just beat the shit out of him. It wasn't very long, and again, they were quickly back up to their feet, and the crowd was booing again. But that brief, 40-second exchange is what winds up deciding this fight, in my opinion.
What stopped it? Was it the end of the starting? Was it the end of the time? Or where they stood up?
I'm trying to remember. It was the end of the time, I think. Yeah, the regulation time had ended, and then they were standing up again.
But it was probably just too close to call. No, they wouldn't call it until it goes on to the end of overtime.
Yeah, because the way the rules work back then, we don't have overtime anymore, but the way the rules worked back then was if there was a finish in regulation, the fight ended, but if the fight didn't end in regulation, then you'd go to overtime, and then there'd be a judge's decision. Yeah. Because they were trying to keep judges out of it, and I get it. I mean, the idea behind this sport was 2 men enter, somebody has to win, but turns out that doesn't always make for great TV, so you kind of have to change that up a little bit. Unfortunately, sometimes shit like this happens.
Just about the entirety of the first overtime, because we have 2 overtimes.
There were no punches in the first overtime. No strikes thrown at all.
Nothing.
And I was reading this before I fucked their names up. Due in part to the special rule, the super fight between Dan and Ken is widely considered one of the worst MMA fights of all time. with the fighters circling each other for nearly 20 minutes with little or no contact. I actually disagree with that. Like, yeah, the fight was, like, objectively bad. I'm not going to sit here and tell you it was a good fight.
But it wasn't 20 minutes with nothing happening.
Yeah, and
There was
also,
some stuff
I feel like
sparse
we've
there.
seen worse fights. Like, I would rather watch this than Ken and Hoist 2.
Yeah.
Because Ken was just laying in his guard. Like, I'm not going to rehash that.
At least this had exciting moments.
Yeah.
Sure, we had to wait a while to see them, but there were moments.
Exactly.
As opposed to just laying on each other.
Yeah, just guard play for, like, 37 minutes.
Yeah. We can't do that forever, Hoist.
Yeah, when the fight ended, the crowd was booing. They were throwing shit into the octagon. And we headed to the judges for a decision. And it was actually fairly dramatic. The first judge, I guess, wasn't paying attention that much. Or I'll be kind. It was a close fight to judge. I think Dan won based off that one exchange, but there was so little going on that if you scored it for Ken, it's not like a robbery or anything. But the first judge scored it for Ken in his little position, raises his placard, says Shamrock on it. Then they cut to the Crypt Keeper. The Crypt Keeper had to fight for Daniel, and then it was up to the former NFL player to determine the winner of the super fight.
Who kept his little sign down and was just like peering around the room like
Wait for
everyone
it.
looking.
Wait for it.
I control this.
And then he raised it up, and the crowd kind of erupted because the fight sucked, but the hometown guy won.
Yep.
Dan won, and dude, even the commentators were not kind to them during this fight. They literally mentioned like, well, there is the threat of a possible fine. I hope it wouldn't come to that. And I'm like, damn, guys, that's pretty extreme.
It just wasn't a great fight. The crowd was unhappy. They started throwing stuff into the ring. Much worse than just the one wiener.
Yeah, this was like, I mean, it wasn't like a full pro wrestling onslaught of just endless shit into the ring, but there was like 6 or 7 different pieces of trash in there.
Yeah. Someone threw a cigarette butt at one of the commentators.
Yeah.
Which people are smoking indoors. It's more
it's
acceptable.
the 90s, bro.
Yeah, it's not great.
So yeah, we don't have a lot of like a fun way to end this because the fight wasn't fun. But we do have for you is fun. Is our next.
We do have a fun thing to end this.
Oh, we do?
Yeah.
What is it?
Dan was challenging Hoist Gracie.
Yeah.
That never happens.
That doesn't happen. Yeah, it was so weird because you could tell he had this little like sheet ready for a dominant victory. He was like, "Now I've defeated Ken. I'm coming for Hoist." But he won this like tepid split decision.
Yeah.
So you see him just kind of raising the banner like, "Hey, Hoist, you should like kind of maybe fight me sometime. That'd be cool." And as we went over in prior podcasts, Hoist doesn't come back for a very long time. So his challenge was unsuccessful. And honestly, if I was Hoist and I saw that fight, I'd be like, "Why do I want to fight you?" Yeah. That was horrible.
Because of the pay-per-view numbers, we can assume that the whole "this is human cockfighting" argument that was happening before this, it was kind of a nod to that with Dan's sign.
Yeah, on the back of the sign for like it was the front was just text like challenging Hoist Gracie to UFC 10. The back of the sign was like a Rooster version of Hoist and a Rooster version of Dan.
Yeah.
So they were literally like, "Hey, John McCain, blow me."
Yeah. So we did have a little fun at the end.
We did, and we will have way more fun, hopefully, next time when we cover, I believe it's UFC 10. Let me verify that real quick. Up next, by popular demand, the tournament is back. UFC 10, entitled very simply, The Tournament. So we'll see the return of the tournament format at UFC 10.
Can we see anyone that's on there?
I see people's, like, butts and thighs. I can't really see anybody's face.
I see, like, just general muscle on display.
Muscly men up next on UFC 10. Until then, thank you guys so much for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please leave a like and a comment if you got anything you want to say. And we'll see you guys next time.
Bye, we love you. I got flashbacks to the Aladdin trailer.
The Aladdin trailer.
You not see that?
I heard everyone was upset, but I didn't actually watch it.
Oh, you gotta see it.
I don't know if I want to be that upset.
You do.